Hey gang, Uncle Josh here. Before we get started on this volume of Uncle Josh's True Scary Stories, I wanted to say thank you to all the people who are emailing me, to those of you who are subscribing to this channel, and to those who are commenting on the page. It's wonderful to see that. I'm glad that you're all enjoying it. I love the criticism that I get. I think it's always good to have feedback, so I appreciate those of you who share your thoughts, and I hope you continue to do so. If you do have a creepy, scary story that you would like me to narrate, please feel free to email me at any time. unclejoshtruescarystories@gmail.com. Also, if you are liking what you're hearing, please like, share, and subscribe to this channel because it will only help the channel grow and it'll make it easier for me to continue coming up with good stories, and I hope that I will continue to do that. I will be honest with you, this is actually a side project from what I normally do. I've had a paranormal radio show, which is a call-in interview show for the last 7 years, both on terrestrial radio and on the internet. That will be coming back in a couple weeks, so I hope you will check that out. The website for more information is theedgeoftheunknown.com, and I'm going to be putting up old archives there. You will be able to hear it live every Sunday from 8 to 10 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, and lots of good guests already lined up, so I know that you guys will dig that. It's not true scary stories, but it is talking about everything from astral projection to UFOs and everything in between with the leaders of the paranormal. I think that you guys will think that's pretty cool, and I hope that you will check that out as well. Lastly, I've had a couple of emails asking if this is my real voice. I've got kind of a cold going on right now. I don't know if it's just sinus stuff or what, but I do modify my voice a little bit, and you'll hear that after you hear this little piece before the narration begins. But this is the voice I was born with, this is what I have, and this is what I use. So I hope that you'll find it pleasing. I hope that you like the stories. And again, if you've got anything that you want me to know about or you want me to share, Uncle Josh, truescarystories@gmail.com. And of course, you can find me on Facebook. All right, I'm going to shut up and get to the good stuff. Thanks for listening, and enjoy.
The stories you are about to hear are true. Some names and locations have been changed at the author's discretion. Welcome to Uncle Josh's True Scary Stories.
Cannibals on our camping trip? This was about 10 years ago. I was around 12 at the time. I grew up in a small town in southern Ontario, Canada, where there really wasn't anything to do during the summer holidays. To defeat the summer boredom, my father and I would take 2 weeks every summer and rent a cabin up north. Our favorite place to go was a small tourist island called Manitoulin Island, which was a 6-hour drive from our hometown and then an hour-plus ferry ride across the lake to the island. While on the ferry, an older gentleman in a semi-formal suit was handing out a small stack of papers in the tourist section of the boat. My father and I approached him and took one of his flyers. It was a map of the island, crudely designed in MS Paint or the equivalent of any other free drawing program you can find on the internet. On the map was various tourist attractions and picnic areas. We thanked the man, excited to travel the entirety of the island, which was the original plan, and then we went on our way. Upon returning to the tourist room a half-hour later, the man was no longer there. We had just assumed he had run out of amateur maps. When we finally got to the island, we were exhausted. It took an additional hour and a half to get to our cabin, which was located about 15 feet from the shore of a beautiful rock-bottom lake. We spent the majority of the 2 weeks traveling from one end of the island to the other, hitting every tourist attraction and small tackle shop we ran into. On the final 3 days of our trip, we had run out of places to go, and then my father remembered the map. At the very bottom right corner of the map, which was also the lowest, most accessible tip of the island, was a long dotted line that indicated an extensive dirt road. At the end of the road was a picnic area. We thought, why not? Man, it's right by the lake. It might be awesome. We packed our bags and loaded them into the old 1988 Ford Mustang ragtop my father owned. This car had been pushed to its absolute limits this trip and was having more difficulty starting with each passing day. The oil had run significantly thin due to the extreme summer heat and the abuse it was going through, but the car was still moving, and my father, being a mechanic himself, thought nothing of it and didn't think anything was wrong. The oil pressure always resumed its normal viscosity after the car had rested a few hours. We got our old school paper map out and plotted our route. The drive was beautiful, open fields and mighty emerald forest. That was until we started to reach civilization, if you could call it that. The houses that came into view were quite disheveled in each town we passed through, and while in one of the native towns, we witnessed an entire town of Native Americans, covered in red and black war paint. They stared at us as we drove past, but again, we thought nothing of it. Probably just a ceremony or a celebration that we had unknowingly disrupted. Shit, I'd be angry too if someone did that to me. Finally, we made the final turn that would take us down this elusive dirt road, the last one we had yet to discover. At this point, we had been driving for about 2 hours, and the heat had made the car's oil pressure gradually drop, but we were too close to our destination to turn back. As we drove down the road, we noticed the run-down and mostly boarded-up houses became fewer and fewer. The distance between them grew larger until finally there were no more houses to be seen. The road simply turned from asphalt to cracked gray stone to loose gravel to dirt. The road became so narrow, only a single car could fit on it at one time, and we hoped no one on a four-wheeler would come around the bend like a bat out of hell, not expecting visitors. I would also like to mention the telephone poles stopped at the gravel road. Whatever was back here had no electricity supplied to them by the town. The further we went, the more uneasy we became. We saw old abandoned logging equipment in the mangled trees. The sun became blotted out by the thick foliage overhead. We continued to drive, making jokes about the hills have eyes and wrong turn and all the other horrible situations of the sort in terrible movies we had seen, and finally we reached a clearing. Down a driveway shooting off the clearing, we saw what could only be described as a massive burning stake that looked like something they used to burn witches. This thing was massive, at least 15 feet high, with a 10-foot platform halfway up. It was built out of twine, logs, twigs, and straw. In the middle of the platform was a massive log that stood up from the middle and stood probably another 8 feet high. Seriously, Google burning at the stake and that is exactly what this thing looked like. A little further down the driveway was an old 2-story house. It reminded me of a plantation mansion, not because of the size, but design. Almost all of the windows were shattered, and an old door hung off a single hinge at the entrance. A mere 10 feet from the house was a cliff that dropped off straight into a rocky lake below. My father and I thought we had missed a turn, but there was absolutely no way to go but straight. My stomach dropped when I looked just past the creepy old house. Beside it was a beat-up old white van that looked like it had rolled through a ditch, and next to that a picnic table. A single wooden picnic table with plates, glasses, and silverware on it. My father and I exchanged nervous glances, when all of a sudden out of the corner of my eye I saw a dust cloud. There was a beat-up red pickup truck racing towards our parked car. It had come from behind the house, and the driver had his foot to the floor. My father panicked. He threw the Mustang in reverse and spun around so fast I almost vomited. He shifted into drive and tore away, but something made his eyes widen. Me too. The truck behind us was beeping, and I saw an arm holding a machete hanging out of the passenger side window. The oil pressure in our car was dangerously low. Dad swore as he gunned it. The car made a small cry of anguish before ripping up the dirt and bits of gravel as we tore out of there, like our lives depended on it. Hey, who knows? Maybe it did. Before we began pulling away, though, I saw more people coming out of the brush with knives and machetes, and some began running down the road after us. We soared down that dirt road, taking risky turns, catching air when we hit huge holes in the ground, and all the while the car screaming at him, begging to stop. But he didn't. He never slowed down. He never looked back. We finally arrived at the paved part of the road, and my father looked behind us. No one was following us anymore. He slowed down slightly, but I knew he was still well over the speed limit. Once we cleared the areas that advertised their shitty housing, we pulled into the first garage we saw. The car nearly died right then and there. The last 2 days we just stayed in our cabin, trying to recount what had happened, and also unable to really do anything because the car repair had used up the rest of our spending money. The day we left the island was the last time we spoke about the incident. We did, however, look for the man giving out the maps on the ferry ride home. He wasn't there. We asked a couple of the locals that were going to the mainland for shopping, and no one had ever heard about this so-called picnic area that we had visited. In fact, when we showed them the map we were given, no one could recognize the area past the small towns that were before it, but warned us that the inhabitants of those towns weren't always the kindest to strangers, and it was probably a bad idea to go down there. I don't know if horror movies have tainted my brain, but if they have taught me anything, I like to think that that picnic area is a trap to get curious people to drive down there so they can be killed and barbecued on their shrine, or maybe just robbed, I don't know. So, for any of you planning on visiting Manitoula Island, I hope I didn't deter you. It is a beautiful and peaceful place, and the locals are friendly, kind, and trustworthy, but if you ever see a kinder older gentleman in a semi-formal suit on a ferry, take his map and smile. Some of the locations are truly majestic, but never, and I mean never, go to the picnic area at the bottom point of that island. Miss Ellie. This happened back when I was 10. Some of you may be skeptical and some may not be, but I'm now 24 and I firmly believe in the paranormal. I was an adventurous 10-year-old girl and loved meeting new people. I grew up in a small neighborhood where everyone knew everyone, and I was back and forth between my mom's and grandparents' house because my mom was going through a bad divorce and also worked odd hours. It just was better for me to be in the next town over with my grandparents. Often, when visiting my grandparents, I'd also go up the street to visit with this woman who we will call Miss Ellie. Miss Ellie was an elderly woman, probably somewhere in her late 70s. I would sit on her porch and we would have long talks, play little games, and she was kind of like a second grandmother. I always noticed, though, when I would bring her over food or whatever, she never touched any of it. Being 10 at the time, I didn't think about why. After about 2 months, I was going to go back to live with my mom. The day before it was time for me to go, I made 2 sandwiches to take over to Miss Ellie's. As I was walking out the door, my grandmother stopped me and asked where I thought I was going. Scared I was in trouble, I replied, "To Miss Ellie's. We're going to have a picnic before I have to go back to Mommy's." The look my grandmother gave me sent chills down my spine. You know, the one when you think you're really in deep trouble? Yeah, that's the look I got. My grandmother then looked at me and said with a crackling voice, "Jenna, Miss Ellie's from the house down in the corner?" "Yes, Grandma, why?" "Honey, Miss Ellie has been dead for 2 years now. No one's lived there since her passing. Are you sure it's Miss Ellie?" With butterflies in my stomach, I dropped the sandwiches on the floor. Tears rolled down my face, and scared I replied, "Yes, Grandma." I told her what the woman looked like, and her face went white. It was indeed Miss Ellie, but I never went back there again.
My haunted Brooklyn apartment. I had just moved out of my apartment in Brooklyn into one in Manhattan, under circumstances that were a little strange, namely a psychotic roommate with a bad drug problem, but that has a little something to do with the story, but I thought I would wait until I had related the story of what I thought was a mother and daughter that had passed that were living in my apartment with us before I get to that part. I moved to the place in early August. It was the 3rd floor through in a brownstone right by Prospect Park. Lower slope or churchside slope for those of you familiar with New York City lingo. It was a beautiful old building with hardwood floors and wall moldings and quaint modeled light fixtures, the whole bit. My landlady, who lived right downstairs, grew up in the house. Perhaps she could have shed a bit of light on the situation had her English been a little bit better. In any case, the rent was practically nothing, I had 2 rooms to myself, and it was too good to be true. My roommate had already lived in the apartment for 3 years. He had told me that Jenny, the landlady, often let herself in to check on things without knocking, so when I felt someone watching me, I figured it was Jenny. Every time I turned around, though, there was nobody there. I often thought I saw the edge of a skirt or a black boot heel disappearing around the corner, but I could never turn around fast enough. Finally, after a week or so, I mentioned it to my roommate. He replied that he had long suspected the place was haunted. Other sensations contributed to that impression. For example, the cold spots in the kitchen. The entities seemed to concentrate on the kitchen and the back rooms where I lived. The kitchen doorway in particular. One day I was mopping the kitchen floor and sweating like a pig when I suddenly felt cold to the bone. I mean, this was the dog days of summers, but I was freezing. The hackles on my neck stood up, and I knew someone was there with me. Other times, one of us would be cooking, and we could feel someone standing right behind us. But when you turned around, of course, there was nothing. Strange things continued to happen. Nothing threatening, but nothing easily explained either. A glass of water I had placed on an end table spilled on me in the middle of the night, when it was 8 feet away where I left it. My shoes were often paired up neatly in front of the closet in the morning, even though I had left them a mess the night before. One time I came up the stairs to the apartment, and I heard voices in the kitchen. Then, when I fit my key in the lock, they passed by the front door and into the living room, which lay sort of beyond the front door, and they went back into my roommate's half of the apartment. Once I got into the apartment, I could see there was nobody there. Okay, so big deal, you say, and you'd be right. I couldn't prove there were entities in the apartment, nothing ever manifested it to me visually, but I just knew somehow. I knew there were 2, both female, one about 30 years old and one younger, maybe
10 to 12 years old, possibly mother and daughter. I could feel it. And then my suspicions were confirmed on 2 separate occasions. The door slamming and the incident with my cat. First, I'll explain the door slamming. As I mentioned before, the apartment is a floor-through, and on windy days the doors will often slam shut if they aren't propped open. But occasionally, if stuff in the apartment was being rearranged or a great deal of noise was being made, the doors in the back would slam shut. They would open about 6 inches, slam again, open, slam, open, slam, faster and faster, like someone was having a tantrum and couldn't stop yanking on the handle. After a month in the place, I was fairly used to the various carryings-on, and I would yell, "Stop it!" And the slamming would stop, just like this. Slam! And the door would slowly reopen about halfway. A friend of mine, Andrew, came over to visit, and he didn't believe any of this, so once after a few beers in the living room, I called towards the back of the apartment. "Andrew doesn't believe in you. If you're in here, slam the back bedroom door." That door happened to be blocked with a Doc Martin boot of mine, which promptly rolled into the hall, and that trick was followed by a symphony of slamming from the back, closet doors as well, which convinced Andrew not only of the ghost's existence, but also of the desirability of leaving for the nearest bar at top speed. The other thing that confirmed their presence was my kitten. I brought him home once and let him out of his cat carry, and he ran under the tub. When he finally consented to come out, he wouldn't go anywhere near the kitchen and would just sit meowing at something in the kitchen doorway, occasionally growling and fluffing up his tail as if threatened. I always tried to get behind him on these occasions. If I could look between his ears, I might be able to see something or someone, but I could never move fast enough. These presences weren't threatening, as I've said. It was creepy, of course, but more annoying than anything else. This is going to sound utterly foolish, but when I was trying to get out of my hellish roommate situation, I actually asked them to protect me from my roommate, who was getting more and more out of control, going through my things, threatening my friends, coming home all fucked up every night, and so on. I figured it couldn't hurt to enlist their aid. I finally moved out last Saturday. My dad and brother came to help me cart all my gear into Manhattan, and I sent my brother up with the keys to lock the door when we had brought the last load down to the van. He came back down and said the door was already locked. Weird stuff, but I have to say that those two, whoever they were probably the most stable thing in my life for 2 or 3 months. I guess that's kind of a sad statement about my life, I know, but at least I've moved on, and I don't care to move back. Red Eyes. I've been investigating paranormal phenomenon for about 30 years now, and this is by far the most dramatic case I've investigated. While living in Phoenix, Arizona, I had heard about a place haunted by a pair of glowing eyes just outside of Casa Grande, which is south of Phoenix. This was one of those houses in which no one will spend more than one night. Yeah, I know, those stories are a dime a dozen and can never seem to be verified, which is why I didn't worry too much about this one at the time. Several years after I heard about the place, a friend and I were in the area and were able to find this particular property. So we said, what the hell, let's investigate. We arrived early in the afternoon to find a long-abandoned 2-bedroom, 1-bath mobile home set on about an acre of land with no other habitation within a mile radius. There was, of course, no electrical service or water from the well. The trailer had been severely vandalized inside and out, with the door torn off and most of the windows smashed. When I first heard of it, the trailer was in good condition. Even in daylight, there was a feeling of something there, an indescribable, someone who hates me is looking at me feeling. We got our equipment ready and settled down to wait. Well, after nightfall, nothing happened, and we had pretty much decided it was all a hoax. Like, haha, great joke, we're gonna hit the sack. No reason for both of us staying up. Chris took the first watch, and at about 10 p.m., she nudged me awake to let me know that it had arrived. From the back bedroom, the feeling of being watched was very strong, and a pair of red eyes was visible out the window. They seemed to be about 200 yards distant. When the eyes appeared, they would remain for a minute or two and just vanish, only to reappear elsewhere. They seemed to be working in closer most of the time, but not with every reappearance. Within an hour, we had seen the manifestation from every window, and the feeling of being watched was strong throughout the house. By midnight, it had come indoors, and was accompanied by a feeling of intense evil and an induced fear on our part. At times, we were within 3 feet of them, but we would not approach them when it materialized closely, because of our fear. The best we could do was not run away. The eyes appeared about 6.5 feet above the ground, and were about 3 inches across, with irises about 1 inch in diameter, with cat-like pupils that reacted to light. As we moved, the eyes moved to follow us. If one of us kept the eyes' attention and the other moved behind them, they were not visible to the person behind, as if they were in a person's head, but only the eyes were visible. Whenever it showed up in a room, the temperature of that room would quickly seem to drop to about freezing from an ambient temperature of 50 degrees Fahrenheit, yet the thermometer noted no physical temperature changes. This temperature drop was readily notable, even if they were not seen, as when one of us was looking the other way or had our eyes closed as a control measure. At close range, there was a faint but definite odor of some unidentifiable decay. It was not the smell of composting vegetable matter, nor of a dead animal, or even a human. Believe it or not, dead people smell different from, say, a dead dog. Our emotional responses of fear and evil increased as the distance to the manifestation decreased. We experimented by moving around the area, and the manifestation usually materialized within 100 feet of us, although at varying ranges. It would not cross the dirt road in front of the house, nor come more than about 100 yards south of the house. We found no such border to the north and west, but we were not willing to go more than 100 yards into the desert on these sides. Once on the other side of the road and clear of the affected area, we decided to remain there until morning, when we would go back and get our equipment. Due to the open terrain and the fear that it induced in us, I still did not shoot at it with my pistol. Chris did throw a few rocks at it from the other side of the road, but that did not appear to affect it at all. Photographs of it revealed only fogged film on both visible light cameras, 200 and 1000 speed films. IR showed only a blurred blob on non-flash shots and nothing on IR flash shots. No source or cause was found during a daylight search of the area, and no possible source or cause was found during a check of local records. The few neighbors that lived miles away only reported that the area was supposed to be haunted and that it had been haunted since forever, but they also knew nothing about the possible source or cause of the haunting. Other than that it existed and we saw it, felt evil, and were scared, I still have no idea what it was. The memory still comes back to haunt me sometimes, but it was the most intense investigation I've ever been on.
The Sleaze in the Bathroom. Submitted by Shara D. A few years ago, I was invited to a party, and me rarely ever being invited to parties, I decided this time to say yes. I went with my friends. Let's call them Eric and Mike. Eric and Mike had been my two best friends since my last best friend had moved to another country. When we arrived at the beach, we did the usual, found a bench, sat down, and started talking about stuff. A couple hours later, we had gotten some drinks and we were still talking, but I said to them that I had to go to the bathroom. Now, as I was washing my hands, I heard some footsteps behind me in the bathroom, but that wasn't it. I heard whispering, too. I knew I was the only one in the bathroom because none of the stalls were locked, so I ran out and ran to Eric and Mike, and they saw the fear in my eyes and asked what's wrong. I wasn't able to talk for some minutes, and when I was finally able to talk, I just told them, "Man, I heard someone in the bathroom." Eric and Mike looked terrified and said they could come with me the next time around if I had to go. So, 3 hours later, I did have to go again, and they went with me. I made sure no one was in the bathroom, and I went into one of the stalls, and I did what I had to do, and went out again and washed my hands. I was talking to Eric and Mike loudly so they could hear me, and just before we were all about to walk out, we heard someone say,
"Where are you going?"
All three of us got scared as hell. We looked behind us and saw a man probably in his late 30s or 40s, or I don't know, maybe he was 6 foot tall. It all gets confusing. He didn't seem to have any weapons, but he started walking towards us, and as he was walking towards us, he was smiling and staring at me. Now, having overprotective guy friends with me, Eric and Mike ran at the man and tackled him to the ground. He didn't seem scared, but he was struggling to get up. Eric screamed at me to call the cops, so I got out my phone and called the police. 10 minutes later, the cops arrived, and I was helping Eric and Mike keep the guy on the ground before the police jumped in. The guy was arrested, and as I was talking to the cops, they told me that they knew him, and he was a serial rapist. Who knows what could have happened if I didn't run out, or if Eric and Mike had not come with me into the bathroom. So, the serial rapist, let's not meet again.
Ouija Trouble. My two sisters-in-law and I became interested in the Ouija board back in the early 70s. We were related by marriage and had moved to the same area from 3 other states, Ohio, West Virginia, and Florida. We ranged in ages from 20-something to 30-something and played with the board every time we got together. We decided to move our game from the house to an old cemetery in the adjoining county where an ancient forefather of my husband was buried. The cemetery was in a secluded, wooded area. It was a lovely, sunny, warm day, so we placed the board on top of his grave and began asking it questions. It told us to leave the cemetery at once because rattlesnakes were all over. Immediately, the sky grew dark and a strong wind began to blow like a thunderstorm was about to hit. Grabbing the board, we raced to the car. As soon as we were safely inside, the wind ceased and the sky turned blue again. We thought it was just a fluke. A few days later, we went to another secluded cemetery, this time to ask where a deceased man who supposedly was wealthy had buried his money. We placed the board on his grave, which was located next to a big old oak tree. We asked our question, and it spelled out that the money was buried under the back door steps, but if we dug it up, something would happen to us. Then, just like before, the sky grew dark and a strong wind began to blow like a thunderstorm was about to hit. We heard a cracking sound. Quickly, we looked up into the tree, and a huge limb was beginning to fall. Leaving the board behind, we made a mad dash to the safety of the car. Once again, the wind ceased and the sky turned blue. This time, we didn't think it was a fluke. We had to go back to retrieve the board, so we cautiously got out of the car. We walked up to the grave and grabbed our board, and then looked around the tree for the big limb that we all saw falling. But there was no limb on the ground. We looked up into the tree thinking that it had gotten wedged between the branches or something. Still, no broken limbs up there. That frightened us pretty bad. We never took our board back to another cemetery after that. However, we continued playing with our board at the house. One day I told my sisters-in-law that I would ask it questions while their fingers touched the planchette. I would write down the answers on a piece of paper. Then I started asking my questions. The first was, what was my father's mother's first name? She had passed away when I was 13 years old, but I had not seen her since I was 9 years old. I never spoke of her to anyone since I had no real clear memories of her. She was always just Grandma, my dad's mom. I watched as it spelled out her first name. My grandmother did not have a common name, and this was correct. My eyes watered and chill bumps covered my body. I asked it the second question, which I can't remember, but I do remember that even though the word was misspelled, it was also correct. We were freaking out. Before this happened, it was all just a fun game, but now it kind of scared me. I quit playing. I never played again. I burned my board. One of my sisters-in-law got rid of hers, too. The other one kept playing with it. Well, that is until something told her that it was going to come for her on a certain night and what it was going to do to her. It terrified her so badly that she quickly got rid of her board, too. None of us has ever touched one since. The Devil's Passage. This encounter took place around 10 years ago when I was 15. I grew up in a place called Clondalkin, a small town just outside of Dublin, Ireland. The town is very old and started as a monastic settlement in the 6th or 7th century, and to this day still contains remnants of old buildings and infrastructure from that era. On the outskirts of town there is a huge park, which is frequented by many people daily due to its wide range of recreational facilities, such as fishing ponds, baseball fields, and playgrounds. It really is a beautiful park, and I'd spent many days there just hanging around with friends. However, like most old towns, Clondalkin is not without its urban legends. One such legend was about a section of the park known as the Devil's Passage. And this legend states that there was a particular location in the park that contains a cursed tree and featured a lot of satanic worship. I won't go into too much detail about the legend, but you can read some interesting forum discussions about the place online. The origins of the legend are questionable at best, but having visited the supposed location, I can see exactly why such mystery surrounds the place. The Devil's Passage is partially enclosed by massive stone walls that creates kind of a courtyard feature, probably the remains of an old building. The last time I was at the location, it contained a large digger and piles of dirt like it was undergoing some sort of construction. At the back wall of the enclosure, there was a small grove of trees that contained the alleged cursed one. In reality, this tree was pretty weird looking. It appeared to be floating. The bottom of the tree was cut off, yet it was entwined amongst the branches of adjacent trees. Even though I always knew it obviously wasn't haunted or cursed, it still always gave me the creeps. Anyways, that's just a bit of context about the place where this terrifying encounter happened. On Halloween of 2006, my two friends and I thought it would be fun to spend the night at the Devil's Passage just for shits and giggles. We were all into the paranormal, and we could think of no better place to spend Halloween than there. Looking back now, it was a pretty fucking stupid idea. It was so remote and secluded in such a large park on a night when the whole city was out getting drunk and partying. After telling our parents we were going trick-or-treating, we headed to the park around 6 p.m. We'd set up our spot at the very back of the grove within Devil's Passage, next to some boulders, which we used as seats. We decided we'd light a fire using some old newspaper we found and some sticks. Looking around at all the empty beer bottles, burnt wood, and graffiti, it was clear that this place was a hot spot for underage drinking and debauchery. Thankfully, we were the only ones here on this particular night. Well, at least for the first few hours. After a short while spent sipping on beers that my friend managed to steal from his dad and puffing on cigarettes, we were visited by this middle-aged man. All of us panicked and started stamping out the small fire we had going. As the man approached, we could see he was wearing a formal black suit with white gloves. This man clearly wasn't a park ranger trying to kick us out. He had gray hair and a goatee. We yelled a "hello" over to him to see what he wanted. He just smiled and kept walking towards us. He told us not to worry and that we weren't in any kind of trouble. We asked him who he was and what he wanted from us. He said he was throwing a bit of a party at that location tonight and asked if we would like to stay for it. At first, my friends and I looked at each other with some disbelief. Was he joking? This guy certainly didn't look like the partying type, especially not the type to host a party in a park on a Halloween fucking night. We told him that it was probably best if we just headed out and that we were sorry to intrude on his party spot. He kept insisting that we stay, and he could offer us free booze and drugs. He even told us that there'd be girls coming that would love to fuck us. While his proposal began to entice my two friends, I was now starting to freak out. Why didn't my friends think it was weird that a middle-aged man was inviting a bunch of 15-year-olds to a party in the woods? After a few minutes of him trying to convince us to stay, it all became too intense for me, and I interrupted him, saying that we all had to go. My friends looked at me puzzled. "We might as well stay just for a few more drinks. It's not even 9, one friend said. I reluctantly agreed, but told them I'd be leaving by 10, with or without them. The more time we spent there, the more unsettled I felt. The man, who told us his name was Stuart, started asking us really weird and personal questions, like if we were virgins, and if we'd ever had sex with another guy, and even if we would be willing to have an orgy. There was something clearly wrong with this guy. He seemed normal at first, but the more he spoke, the more he revealed himself to be batshit insane. I don't know what this guy was doing there, but he definitely wanted us to stay for some reason. He kept telling us that the other partygoers would be coming very shortly with plenty of alcohol and drugs, but none ever arrived. It was as if he was stalling and trying to keep us there for as long as possible. Eventually, I grew tired of waiting around and wasting time with this creepy fuck. I told my friends that I was leaving and I'd see him later. As I began to walk away, Stuart became very anxious. He practically begged me to stick around. At first he was polite, playful even, joking about how I was letting my friends down and that I'd regret it if I didn't stay. When I refused again, the threats started to come. My heart sank. He told me that he'd kick the shit out of me if I tried to leave. His manner quickly changed from being friendly to downright aggressive. My friends finally started to back me up, and they told the man that if he was going to be a dickhead, they would also leave. That's when he took a knife out from the inside of his suit jacket and started brandishing it around and saying that nobody would be going anywhere. With a sudden surge of adrenaline, I picked up a big log from off the ground and whacked him across the head with it. I screamed at the top of my lungs for him to get the fuck away from us and dragged my friends by the arms and started running as fast as I could out of there. He chased us for a little while, screaming about his friends would intercept us on the way out, and they'd catch us. He eventually gave up his pursuit, and we managed to get out of there unharmed. To this day, I don't know who that guy was or what his motives were, but I will never go back to the Devil's Passage at night. At the Myrtle's Plantation. This happened to my mom and my sister when they went to the Myrtle's Plantation a few years ago. My mom and sister were staying in the doll room, where supposedly stuff always moves around while people sleep. The night they were there, before they went to sleep, they went to see this other house or building on the grounds where the rumor was that if you went out at night and looked at the house's windows, the curtains would move or sway or roll up or whatever. They were both out there watching the windows when out of nowhere they heard this blood-curdling scream and ran back to their room. After a few minutes or so, they went out into the hallway where a few other people had popped out of their rooms and were standing there. They asked if my sister and mother had heard the scream too. They said they did, and one couple told them that another older couple had left the grounds earlier that night seeming scared because they had heard repeated screaming throughout the day. My mother came back with some pictures on her phone. They were in some type of wooded area when she took them. You can plainly see what looks like some type of human-shaped ball of light, but my mother really doesn't think it was a ghost. She believes that it was a panther. The sound a panther makes sounds a lot like a human scream, and that would match the two things. My sister really doesn't have an opinion, but she believes there was something out there, she just can't put a finger on it. I have never been to the Myrtles. I don't plan on going to the Myrtles, but just by what my mother and sister said, I think it's possible there is something paranormal happening out there. But that's just my opinion. Santeria Boyfriend. This story is about Santeria, a religion with influences of both voodoo and Catholicism. It originated in the Caribbean, when slaves who were brought over preserved aspects of traditional African religions, but masked them with symbolic Catholic saints so their masters wouldn't know. My ex-boyfriend, who practiced the religion, tapped into some deadly evil spirits, and I fell victim to them, nearly lost my life. This was the most frightening thing that I have ever experienced. I dated someone from Latin America back in 2004. I'll call him Juan to protect his privacy. I broke up with Juan after around 2 months because we had nothing in common, plus he was extraordinarily immature. I felt like we weren't meant for each other and wanted to end things before they got serious. We were only 21. I knew he was Catholic, but never knew why he had a rock relic, maracas, sacrifice stuff, a sacred stick, and color beads that I was never allowed to touch. I asked him about it, but it was something he always kept to himself. A year later, he came back to the States and called me out of the blue, saying he couldn't forget me and was still madly in love. He was really sweet and seemed sincere. I told him for about a month to move on, but he called me religiously 3 times a day. Hesitant to give him another chance, I talked to him on the phone 2 more months, till I was convinced that he'd matured a great deal. So, since he was then living in Arizona, he convinced me to fly out to visit him. He said he wanted another chance. I told him we'd talk and spend time and we could see. So when I flew out there, he was staying at a friend's apartment. The friend was a pro athlete and was gone for 8 days, and it was just Juan and myself. I had a completely open mind about things, and I really wanted them to work out. The summer before, while we were dating, Juan had lived in a different state in this really creepy old apartment that had once been a school about 60 years ago. It had been converted into apartments. It was always dark, and his old roommates, these 25-year-old guys, always said they saw ghosts of children running in the halls and then vanishing through solid walls. During the 2 months we dated, when I was alone in the apartment, I did hear things, but I just assumed they were old boilers or just my imagination. It had never occurred to me that ghosts even existed, much less that ghosts surrounded him and the apartment. I found that out when I flew to Arizona. Keep in mind, I had never even heard of Santeria before this. The second day I was there, he left for work around 7 a.m. I woke up at 10 in the morning, and it was already 112 degrees outside. He had been gone for a couple of hours, and I woke up because I heard pots and pans rattling around in the kitchen. I rolled over, still very tired, but they clanked together like someone was trying to wake me up. I came out of the bedroom yawning and opened the door, saying, "Did you get out early?" Really surprised that he was home already. But when I opened the door, I saw that nobody was in the kitchen. I called out his roommate's name, but he was supposedly out of state. More concerned about a break-in than anything, I went to the front door, but it was locked and deadbolted. So I searched the apartment, thinking Juan was just playing around. But there was nobody there. Ghosts again did not cross my mind, but I couldn't explain what had just happened. There was a frying pan and a saucepan in the sink. I just put my bikini on and went down to the pool just to get out of the house. But even laying on a towel, the beach chair burned my skin, and the pool water was hot like bath water under the dry Arizona sun. I couldn't take the heat anymore, so I reluctantly went back inside the air-conditioned apartment. Juan got home around 1:30, and I was watching a movie. He had this really weird look in his eyes, like hatred in its purest form. I felt like it wasn't him at all. He asked me why I hadn't done anything that day, why I was so lazy. I said there's nothing I could do besides swim. He said there was a mall 10 miles away. I told him, Juan, I don't have a car. In 112-degree heat, there weren't too many options. He said I was lazy and I should have walked. Keep in mind, this is pretty much in the middle of the Tucson desert. He then added that eating sherbet for lunch would only make my thighs bigger. This wasn't him. I don't know if he was possessed or not, but he didn't even remember saying any of these things later on. It was almost like something had taken over the sweet person I once knew. He ended up making me cry, and that's not an easy thing to do. Later that afternoon, I asked him if his roommate had come home early, and he said no, that he was going to be gone for 8 days. Then I said, well, I think maybe one of your neighbors came in the kitchen to borrow some sugar or something, because this was the only half-logical thing I could think of. He said no, he'd locked the doors behind him, asking why I was asking him these questions. I told him about hearing the pans rattling around in the kitchen while I was still in bed. He said, oh, that's just the man, like it was completely normal. I said, what man? really alarmed that there would be a man roaming around the apartment while I slept. He's a spirit. He comes in the room sometimes at night, and he was in there last night. I got goosebumps. I thought he was being sarcastic and just funny, but he said he was dead serious. Especially because he said, like, it was something so normal. He said he didn't think the man would hurt him. He just floated around and stared at him, then would disappear through the wall. All he knew was that the man had been dead for a while. Well, we went to the Mexican grocery store to buy something to cook for dinner. My ex bought eggs and a bottle of vodka and a bunch of toys as an offering to his Santeria shrine. That day the sky was sunny, but half of it started to fill up with storm clouds, and there was a sudden torrent of wind and rain. I was unimaginably on edge, and when I got back to the apartment, the air was so thick with this horrible feeling, I just felt it was like sheer evil. It was a beautiful white apartment, very sunny and bright, but there was a darkness in there that I couldn't describe. And keep in mind, I did not believe in ghosts or anything of the sort. He kept pressuring me to go to bed with him, but I couldn't do it from the day I had just had. Something felt so wrong, spiritually, like unseen forces were at work. So the next morning he went off to work again. Before he left, he kissed my forehead, and then I heard him in the next room with his maracas. He was making his offering to his shrine. I went back to sleep, all alone in the apartment. Again, around 10 o'clock, I woke up suddenly. I heard whispering. It sounded like 3 people whispering because they overlapped. I've never had psychotic problems and never heard voices, so I thought I was losing my mind. "Hello?" I asked, and in Spanish asked who was there. The whispers were very faint but steady. I went out into the kitchen, but that's not where they were coming from. All of the windows were closed, and it was dead silent. I went back into the bedroom and could hear the whispers again. They were coming from the bathroom, along the right wall of the bedroom. The bathroom was long and rectangular, like a bowling lane, and one of the biggest bathrooms I'd ever seen. The bathroom was pitch black, as there were no windows, but there was the dim flickering of what looked like candlelight at the very end of the bathroom in the walk-in closet. I was scared beyond belief at this point, as the 3 whispering voices were coming from that same walk-in closet. I grabbed a baseball bat from an equipment bag that I found in the bedroom, turned on the lights in the bathroom, and walked slowly to the end where the closet door stood ajar. I gripped the doorknob, not knowing what I'd find, and I jerked it open with my free hand. The whispers stopped instantly, and I saw a circle of candles, the rock relic in the middle in its little nest, a plate with 3 whole eggs, the unopened bottle of vodka to the right, and little candies and small child's toys in a pile in front of it. I should have felt relieved, but I didn't. There was a presence around that relic. It was so still, almost like static. You know when you go to a wake or a funeral and you're next to the coffin, around the body there's just that uncanny stillness? And that was the feeling right now. There was a picture behind the candles of someone with black smeared all over their face. I picked it up, and it was my ex-boyfriend with a painted face. I dropped the picture and almost caught it on fire with one of the candles, and I was so nervous I actually caught myself saying, I'm sorry, to the rock. I was truly feeling like I was out of my mind. My stomach rolled. I had adrenaline rushing through my body, fully expecting to find human intruders robbing the place, but instead I found that the voices were coming from this ritualistic shrine. I backed out of the closet staring at the rock, feeling like I was just staring at something living. I closed off the bathroom. That day while I was cooking lunch, Juan just started suddenly being so hateful to me. He had asked if I had touched his rock or his beads, and I said no. He kept his Santeria beads rolled up in a towel on the top shelf of the closet. They had evidently been moved, but not by me. He freaked out over it. Then he went on a rant calling me fat, and then when he made me cry, he said I was ugly when I cried, so I should stop immediately. Then he tried to hug and kiss me, and I fought and pushed him and pounded him away until he let me go. He looked at me and said, "You really are crazy." Within literally 5 minutes, he denied ever saying anything to me that was negative, and asked why I was crying, as though something had momentarily come over him. I was beside myself, like I was living in the Twilight Zone. I went out on the balcony to call my best friend, but the 116-degree was just suffocating. I called her anyway. My hands were shaking, and I wanted to go home. I was so terrified, but home was across the country. She told me to get along with him as best as possible and hang in there. There was no telling what he might do, especially because he had been so sweet all summer over the phone, convincing me he loved me just to get me out there. My mom beeped in on the call waiting, and I wiped my tears away, because I didn't want her to hear me freaking out. Juan was just staring at me the whole time, pressed against the glass door. He looked at me again with hatred in his eyes. I'd never seen this before in my life. It was like something was in him and had taken him over. That night I felt like crap. He had verbally beaten me down so badly. He insisted we go to the mall. He took me to a jewelry store to look at engagement rings. I was afraid to say no, because I didn't know if he was crazy or possessed or what, but I just was indifferent. My eyes kept welling up with tears, and I refused to talk to him. I was just like a little beaten-down dog. before we got into his SUV, he bought cinnamon rolls and was teasing me with them. I'm 5'10" and 124 pounds. I'm an ex-model, and he turned my middle name Michelle into Michelin, like the brand name car tires, because he said I was fat and had spare tires. He knew I had once, in my modeling days, been severely anorexic, and I didn't want the cinnamon rolls, and he forced me to eat them. I was convinced he was insane. There was a horrible summer storm brewing, and the evening sky turned black over the desert mountains. There was soon snake lightning stripping the sky, and I begged him to go home. He drove me around Tucson, as we passed this big cemetery in the middle of lightning and torrents of rain. He said he went there sometimes, that his madrina, or godmother in his country, was a Santeria priestess, and practiced the religion from cemeteries because she called on the powers of the dead. He called her daily, and always had put her over me the whole time we dated. He then told me that's where she had gotten the rock relic from, a cemetery, and she had to bless it in a special ceremony. So, did spirits follow the rock then? My head was racing. I was about to pass out, scream, vomit, who knows. I had never been this freaked out in my life. What happened next nearly took my life. We got back to the apartment, and by that time, the heavy rain had subsided. It was so humid, so hard to breathe. There was a TV in the dashboard of the SUV, and he decided to put in the Michael Jackson DVD and fast forward to Thriller. I remember thinking, you've got to be kidding me. He wasn't trying to be mean, he actually just really liked Thriller and to see dead people dancing around. The irony is he had really curly hair like MJ, and looked quite a bit like him. He wanted to watch it, and I wondered why he preferred a pitch-black, stuffy concrete garage to just going inside and watching it. He started chewing tobacco, a smell that still freaks me out to this day because it reminds me of that night. We pulled into the tiny cement one-vehicle garage of the apartment. It was so small there was only room enough to open the vehicle doors. It was like a vault. He put the garage door down. The SUV was still running. After about 60 seconds, he said how we were going to watch the whole DVD. I asked him to turn the car off, and he asked why, and I told him about carbon monoxide poisoning. He laughed and told me I was stupid, that a human being couldn't die from that. I reached for the keys to turn off the ignition, and he grabbed my wrist before I could touch them and said, "You've got to be smart, Mammy. Stop being so dumb." By this time, about 3 minutes had gone by. The heat was suffocating, and I knew we would die if we could not get out of this garage. It had no ventilation, and the SUV was huge and put out a lot of exhaust. He had locked us in. Looking around, I unlocked the door, popped the garage door button, and crawled out before he could put it all the way back down. Then I ran up the stairway to the outside door of the apartment. He followed me very slowly. He was extremely intelligent, and there was no way he wouldn't have known about carbon monoxide poisoning. Furthermore, it was nearly 100 degrees, and there was no reason to watch a DVD in a tiny closed garage with a vehicle running in the Arizona heat. The only thing I could think of was that he knew I'd never stay with him now after he'd mistreated me on this visit, especially after I couldn't even bring myself to look at wedding rings. I thought maybe he figured if he couldn't have me, nobody could. What happened next, I'll never forget. He turned nice again after his Santeria ceremony, and he insisted that we go to the pool. It was foggy and humid, and everything was soaked from the storm. It was very dark, so I didn't really want to, but my alternative was to stay alone in that apartment with those whispering things and the dead spirit man floating around. So I reluctantly put on my suit and went with him. He swam laps in the dark, and I watched from a poolside lawn chair as clouds covered the moon. I kept complaining that I felt this huge pressure in my chest, that it was hard to breathe, and he didn't care. I got to the point where that I couldn't catch my breath at all. There was a strong wind, and I heard a rumble of thunder again. It began to rain lightly, but then the rain picked up, and I told him I wanted to go back inside. He acted like I was annoying him, so he dried off, and we walked back through the complex. When we got to the base of the outdoor steps to go up to the apartment, there were hundreds of yellow flower petals soaking wet and scattering the ground, like someone had just ripped 50 or 60 roses apart. I stopped dead in my tracks. I was gasping for air, and I've never had respiratory problems. He just stared at me as I had to sit down on the sidewalk in my towel, and didn't even try to help me. Yellow roses held a great significance to me that I had never shared with anyone. When I was little, my grandmother had yellow rose wallpaper, and yellow roses had always been my favorite flower. I had never told anyone, not even my friends, or relatives, or any guy I dated what my favorite flower was, because I always prayed that the man I'd marry would give me a yellow rose. I always teased boyfriends that they'd have to figure it out, but never told anyone. And here, in the period of 20 minutes at the pool, there were hundreds of ripped-apart yellow rose petals, destroyed at my feet, that hadn't been there when we came down. They weren't scattered romantically either, just like in a big wilted heap. It was like something was pushing on my chest, and I felt like maybe if he couldn't suffocate me in the garage, he was somehow finding a way to do it now. I hate to say this, and I don't say it lightly, but death was in the air. The storm started again, and after the garage incident, the cemetery, the whispering, the dead man floating around the apartment, and the hundreds of dead rose petals, I was ready to run away. But I was in the middle of the desert with an oncoming storm, and there was nothing I could do. That night he went into the closet with his maracas. I acted like I was exhausted, mainly because I couldn't stand to face the hellish reality I was living in. It was my last night there, and I just had to survive. He stared at me for nearly 2 hours as I slept, and I wondered what he was thinking, especially since he had just finished some kind of ritual ceremony. The next morning, before he took me to the airport, I once again looked in the walk-in closet. There were yellow candles and a jar of honey in the corner. When I got home and researched Santeria on the web, I learned that yellow candles and the practice of Santeria are used in fertility ceremonies. Or you could cover a yellow candle in honey and inflict suffering and bodily harm through the spirit world on a desired person. I felt a chill go down my spine. Had that been what he had done before we went to the pool? Had he planned an accident in the water when I couldn't catch my breath? He had been angry that I didn't want to get in the water. And my second thought was that since he had been trying so hard to be physically involved with me all week, but I wouldn't, and thank goodness, maybe he was really doing a fertility ceremony. I was confused. I think he was either trying to trap me into a relationship or destroy me to make sure nobody else ever had me. And the last time I talked to him, when I was safely thousands of miles away, he had no recollection of locking me in the garage with the SUV running, and still held that he had nothing to do with the torn-apart yellow roses. But there's no way that he could, that anybody could know about my love for them. Only perhaps the spirit world. His erratic behavior was one thing, and I would not necessarily thought it was spirit possession, except that I knew him, and that wasn't him. Plus the spirit man, the whispering, the attempt to kill me in the garage, the respiratory attack, the roses, there was some evil entity at work here. Coming home, I was thankful to have escaped with my life. As a translator by trade, I have since known other people who practice Santeria, who are totally normal and some of the happiest, funniest, and sane people I've ever met. I just believe that my ex somehow had tapped into an undesirable spirit, and was very susceptible to them. I know I have never been the same since, and I certainly believe now more than I ever did. I thank God every day for my protection. I just wanted to say this as a warning, never dabble in Santeria or Ouija boards or anything to do with the spirits if you're an amateur. We see funny portrayals of voodoo dolls in the media, and many people think that conjuring up the dead is okay. I highly recommend against it, as you never fully know who or what might linger with you, uninvited, forever. My neighborhood haunts. I grew up in a very ordinary house in a very ordinary part of southeast Denver. It was not a small house, maybe 2,200 square feet, but it was a simple house for my parents to raise 4 kids. Nothing out of the ordinary happened in the first 10 years of living there, but things quickly took a turn for the worse. In 1983, I was 15, and I began to get scared of the basement. I wasn't the only one. My brother began to become uneasy when he was alone, too. It was cold in a few parts of the basement, something that wasn't always the case previously. I have 2 sisters and a brother, all older, and both of my sisters had already moved out. My brother and I each had our own rooms in the basement. There were cold spots that were mainly in my room and a storage room, but were prone to move around at times. We both had trouble getting to sleep because we both felt that we were either being watched or, at times, like there was something in the basement with us. We both felt like there was more than one presence in the basement. One night I woke up, and there was a person floating eye to eye with me, only about 10 inches above me. I lost it, started kicking my legs and flailing my arms, but they went right through the object. Slowly, he shook his finger at me, and shook his head as if saying, "No, no, no," and floated back into the corner and disappeared. It took me about 5 minutes to get the nerve to jump out of bed and run over to the light switch, which happened to be in the corner where he disappeared. I can remember that my brother was not at home that night, and I never said anything to my parents, but I did tell my brother, and he believed me. The person, or whatever it was not translucent. In fact, other than a large scar under his left eye, and that he was floating above me and arms and legs went through him, he looked quite normal. The next day I was watching the news, and I found out a couple living about 3 houses down from us were found stabbed to death. That really freaked me out. They were a young couple, and my oldest sister knew them. Not really friends, but she knew them. I never told her what I saw, but I did ask her what they looked like, and she told me. The husband, as she described him, could have very well been the figure that was floating above me, but I can't be sure it was unless I saw a picture of him. To this day I can still picture him in my mind with the clarity I saw him that night. A few months later I was sitting in my bed and reading with my dog, a small poodle named Dink, as he lay next to me. All of a sudden Dink's head shot up in the air like he noticed something and looked over at the door and began growling. The light was on in my room, but I could see a large patch of white, this mist kind of stuff, just floating in the doorway. It stayed there for about 30 seconds and then began slowly drifting into my room. I felt massive chills going up and down my back as I saw it float to the corner, and then it started coming towards my bed. I pushed myself to the back in the corner of my bed as far as I could go to get away from it when it stopped and floated back towards the same corner that I had seen the figure months before. Then it disappeared. I knew I wasn't just seeing this thing because I noticed that Dink was following it with his eyes and who was still growling. Before it disappeared, Dink jumped off the bed and took off out the door. I heard him a few seconds after it disappeared. He was still growling and whimpering, but now he was by the stairs in the other room, and then I heard him tear ass upstairs. Once again, I sat there for about 5 minutes, got the guts to get up, peek around the corners while glancing in every direction around me. I got to the bottom of the stairs, looked around once more, and just in case, I took off like a shot up the stairs too. I swear I must have been 3 feet in the air when I reached the top and flew into the kitchen. 2 weeks later, I was asleep in bed when I heard my brother call my name and whisper, "Come here, hurry." I was expecting to get hit by him or have him throw an object at me when I came around the corner, a practical joke that he used to pull on me all the time. When I entered the room, he told me not to say anything, but to look into the storage room. There were no doors in the basement, just walls separating the room and the door frames with no doors in them. The storage room always bugged me because an old couple lived in the house before us. The man was an artist. The wall to the storage room was nearly 20 feet long, and the man painted a huge scene on the wall. Not just part of the wall, but I'm talking the whole wall. There were farms, rivers, bridges, cattle, people, trees, all kinds of stuff all over the walls. I don't know why the wall bugged me, but it just did. Anyway, my brother pointed into the storage room and to the wall and whispered for me to look. It's hard to explain what we saw, but it looked like a patch of air about 3 feet wide and 5 feet high in front of the wall, and it was moving in waves. At first, the patch of air just stayed in one place, but then began slowly moving from the left side of the wall all the way to the right and back again, and then it disappeared. We both looked at each other and were speechless. I sat down on his bed next to him. Nothing was said for a minute or two, like both of us were making sure that it wasn't going to appear again. There were many small occurrences, such as things missing and then being found later in places that were already looked at many times before. My brother or I would usually get blamed for this. My sister swore that she saw a black shadow of a man run across the upstairs living room and knock over a vase that was very important to my mother before it dissipated through the wall. My cousin, we'll call him Jim, is a year and a half younger than me, and he lived about 5 houses down the block. His next-door neighbor was an older man in his 70s. He was very good friends with Jim's family, but I didn't know him very well. One night, Jim was in bed when a large glowing figure of a man appeared in his room and stood there for about 30 seconds while Jim stared at him, and then it just disappeared. He was somewhat scared, but not terribly so, and was able to get back to sleep. When he woke up in the morning, he went into the living room and told my aunt and uncle what had happened. Then they sat him down and told him that the man next door had passed away overnight. Jim swears that it had to have been his neighbor, and that maybe he was checking up on him or maybe just saying goodbye. I had a friend that I'm going to call Steve, who I went to high school with. He was a really nice kid with a very nasty father. He didn't treat Steve or his wife very well. At times he would beat Steve to the point where Steve just started to hate him. They lived in a large house about 2 blocks away. One day Steve was in the bathroom when what he thought was the devil appeared in his mirror and said, "I've got your daddy," and then it disappeared. He ran screaming across the street to another friend's house and started crying and telling him what they had seen. 4 hours later, he got a phone call from his mother saying that his father had died of a heart attack at work. Steve is not one to tell a lie, and I believe that he saw something. All of these events in my neighborhood happened within a 1-year period from 1983 to 1984. I know that a few of these occurrences may have a natural explanation, but there are a few that just don't. There have been no other occurrences in my parents' neighborhood since then, at least that I know of. I have not lived there in 10 years, but I am in contact with many of my friends and family, and I visit my parents all the time. They still live there. I've been slightly interested in ghosts and the paranormal since then, but I haven't studied up on the subject, and believe it or not, I'm not totally convinced what was there were ghosts, but I guess I'll never know.
Hey everybody, thanks for listening to this episode of Uncle Josh's True Scary Stories.
If you have a true scary story that you would like to be featured, please send it to unclejoshtruescarystories@gmail.com. Be sure to add a title, remove any names of people that you do not want to be broadcast, and also a quick note of consent giving me your permission to read your story over the air. Thanks so much again. Please like, share, and subscribe, and I'll see you next time for more true scary stories from Uncle Josh.